Welcome, everyone, to the Workforce Navigator podcast. I'm Steve McDonald, your host. And I guarantee you we have a mind-expanding conversation today with Ed Cohen. Now, Ed, you are currently with a company called SprintRay. I want you to tell us a little bit about SprintRay. But you've worked with companies from Time Warner, Yahoo, Amazon. You spent time at the Booz Allen Hamilton consulting firm. And throughout all of that, you have developed a point of view and a process for hypergrowth in a company, and that it's coming from a cultural transformation perspective. And what I'd love to do before we dive straight into that is stop for a minute and just have you expand just a little bit on your background before we get started.
Yeah, sure. So I have been engaged in the corporate world since the early 80s, and I have had the ability to be a part of some major global transformations. So I was with school teaching in 1984 when the first desktop computers came out. And just after that, I joined IBM to help them deploy desktops by conducting training for their 100,000 employees at the time around the world, who would go home on a Friday. They would come to my classes Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and that of my team, go back to the office on Thursday, and their IBM memory typewriter would be replaced with a desktop computer. And then if you fast forward into the 90s, when we shifted from mainframes to client server, and then the internet came about, we moved from having the red notepads, I'm sure you remember that, the memo pads, to actual email. So all of these transformations I've been able to be a part of, which has been pretty phenomenal all the way up until the most recent one, AI, which is really just turning the world upside down very quickly. And most of my career has been spent supporting tech companies and working for tech companies, including 7 years in India, where I worked with many different tech companies, including 4 years at a company called Tech Manager.
Well, what I want to do is I want to dive in, but in a specific way, because you said something in one of our previous conversations that behavior is on equal par with performance. What did you mean by that? And what's the significance of that?
So most companies just look at one dimension, and primarily one dimension. Now, a lot of companies will look at two dimensions. They'll look at performance, and then they might look at competency. How well is that person learning? How are they building their competencies to get to the next level? But very few companies add what I call the third pillar, or in some companies, the second pillar, depending upon how they're doing it. But for me, it's the third pillar. I call it the 3 C's. So it's culture, competency, and your contribution to the organization, which is the performance. And if you put all 3 of them on equal par, what you end up with is a learning organization that has the right behaviors to have the right relationships, so that there's nothing that really impedes on that company's ability to grow. Because if you have performance at all costs, what you do is you create a competitive environment. I don't know if you've seen this, but I've seen this in many companies, where eventually the conversation centers around we are our own worst competitor, and we're competing with ourselves more than we are with our competitors in the outside world. Well, that usually happens when companies are not measuring behavior and they're not putting a priority on behavior. So that's the key that I have found, that when you introduce the concept of behavior and holding people equally accountable for the behaviors that they demonstrate with their performance and their continuous learning, that's when the company has a true transformation.
Oh, so there's actually accountability as a part of your process in modifying behaviors.
Absolutely. So at SprintRay, we actually have defined our key behaviors. And instead of having core values, we have key behaviors. We have the behaviors that we expect people to demonstrate. And we've defined them. We've defined boundaries around them. We call them the do's and don'ts of each behavior. And then people are measured ongoingly. The ultimate measure happens with their annual assessment, which actually we moved away from an annual assessment process recently to having what we call quarterly conversations. And so the sum total of your 4 quarters of conversation equals your annual assessment. So it's based on those 4 discussions. And those 4 discussions center around the behaviors your competency growth and setting goals around that, and your contribution to the organization. And here I'll show you an example because every one of our employees has this on their desk. So basically, they have the behaviors that they display, and then on the other side is our definition of our culture. And unlike most companies that will pay a PR firm a lot of money to develop the wording for their core values and their culture statement, we do it a little differently with the process that I put in place with companies. We actually have the employees from the ground up, everyone from the mailroom clerk to the CEO working together to define the culture, what's in, what's out, and working together to define the behaviors, those few key behaviors that if everyone demonstrates them, you will be happy to get up and go to work every week. Or as Dr. Ralph Schrader, who was the CEO at Booz Allen, used to say, you'll be happier to keep Booz Allen on your business card rather than putting it on your resume.
Well, here's what I want to do. I want to jump forward and then come back. I want to jump forward to what are some of the benefits? Like at SprintRay, you've had phenomenal growth that's been tied to this process and these key behaviors, the 3 Cs. Tell us a little bit about the growth, the ROI that you've seen from this, and then dig in a little bit deeper into what you did.
Okay. So our journey started out in 2020, right in the midst of COVID, because the company had to send everyone home, except for the people that we couldn't send home, which were like the warehouse workers that were shipping and people who were working in the labs and stuff like that. So let me just back up and say SprintRay is a 3D printing company. So we do not print 3D objects. We actually manufacture 3D printers. We design and manufacture 3D printers. And those 3D printers are used by dentists to create mouth guards, to create surgical guides, and to print crowns. Here's an example of a 3D printed crown, and to print teeth. You can actually print an entire mouth of teeth. And so just to give you an example of how they innovated in the world, it used to be that if you went and had to get a crown in your mouth covering a bad tooth, you would have to do the mold. Then you have to wait 3 weeks with a temporary that kept falling out until you finally got the crown put in your mouth and hopefully it fit and did the job. Today with SprintRay's technology, they can print 3 crowns in 8 minutes. So they scan the person's mouth and they can have the crown in the person's mouth, perfect fit, perfect color in less than an hour. So that's how the evolution of 3D printing has come about. So during COVID, they had to send everyone home. They were concerned about their culture being impacted. At that time, they were also concerned about what was going to happen in the market. They only had 40 people at the time. An interesting thing happened when the world shut down. Dentists, for the first time, had a little bit of free time on their hands. And so they started doing research on what is this new world called digital dentistry. And the company saw its revenues double in less than a year. And then the next year, we experienced 250% growth and then 200% growth the next year after that. And then now we've stabilized at about 30 to 40% growth a year. And so the company went from around 40 people to 600 people pretty much in about an 18-month period. So along the way, the CEO brought me in. At the time, I started as a consultant before I was the chief people officer. And the big concern was, were they going to lose their culture when they sent everyone home and with this rapid growth? So the first thing that I did was a survey and start doing key interviews. So with only 40 people, I was able to interview quite a few people and a broad swath of people at all different levels. And one of the things that we immediately discovered is there were not more than 2 or 3 people that could define the culture the same. By then we had 60 people in the company. It had grown from 40 to 60. There were basically 30 different definitions of what the SprintRay culture was. So the first step was to define the culture. So what do we want our culture to be? And we did that by going through a process that I call identifying everything that's in the culture now, and then breaking it down into what are the things that we want to keep. So that's the intentional side of the culture. And what are the things that have crept into the culture that we don't want to have? That's the accidental side of the culture. So basically, a lot of companies will go, oh, we don't have that much of a culture in our company. No, 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 no. Every company has a culture, and you have two choices. You're either going to let culture happen, in which I call that the accidental culture. It happens whether you like it or not, or you're going to have an intentionally defined culture. Not a lot of companies go down the path of intentionally defining their culture. But if you look at your purpose and then you intentionally define your culture to match the purpose, then you are 2/3 of the way to where you need to be.
So you also have said that doing this cultural transformation can have its consequences too. Tell us the story about your days at Booz Allen Hamilton and what the challenge was there, what the consequences were, but what ended up happening on the outside.
Sure. So at Booz, that was the first time I actually saw this in play. When I first joined Booz Allen, the first month I was there, Time Magazine had a cover story, and the cover story said, Booz Allen Hamilton, they're nothing but brains on sticks. Back then in the late 90s, Booz Allen was doing a lot of business transformation. So they were going into companies and they were the company responsible for saying, look, you got to trim the fat, you got to let go of 1,000 people, or we recommend a merger or something. They also had their government group that was supporting the government in things like intel and cybersecurity and things like that. So there was a lot of division in the company, and their turnover was in the 20 plus percentile when I got there. So they embarked on a journey that they called the people strategy. And that was one of my first responsibilities, was to be one of the leaders in this people strategy and go through the process of figuring out what did we need to do in order to become a more people-centric organization. Our CEO at the time, Ralph Schrader, was very upset about being called nothing but a brain on a stick, which is what they implied. All brains, no heart. So we went through the process of defining, we called them core values at the time. And once they were defined, we actually continued to have a significant amount of turnover, but we actually had turnover at a part of the company that had not experienced turnover, which was our partners. So of the couple of hundred partners that we had in the organization, almost 25% left. Some of them actually left and started another consulting firm, a smaller competitor to Booz Allen. And others just left because they weren't aligned with it. And at the time, people were really worried because if you work in a consulting firm, the way you become a partner is because you've built a certain book of business in an industry or a market. So every time you lose a partner without having a backfill ready, without having your pipeline ready, you actually lose that revenue. That revenue is gone. It's irreplaceable. But in Booz Allen's case, they had the courage to say, okay, if you're not aligned, we're doubling down on these behaviors. We're going to go forward with these behaviors. And they went forward with them. Within less than a year, the company was back in double-digit growth. And so now we were at right around 2000 when it rolled out. And immediately after that was September 11, 2001, which of course the whole of everything went kaput. The company, the country was thrown into an immediate recession after that. And there was a lot going on. But during that period of time, Booz Allen's turnover dropped into the single digits, right around 6%, which was unheard of because most other companies were still dealing with double-digit turnover. And their growth went to around 20% a year. So they were about 500 million when I joined, and they became $1 billion company within 2 years after implementing the core values. So that was the first time that I saw that and started thinking, I wonder how many times this could be replayed.
And you've done it many times. You've done it with Time Warner. You've done it with Yahoo. What have you done? If you could just outline for us your process a little bit here.
Absolutely. So the second time that I did it was when I moved to India, and I was working with a tech company, and I wanted to be able to help them to understand how to put in play defining their culture and the value of the behaviors. And I wasn't sure if it was going to play out because in a completely different culture on the other side of the world, it could have gone the opposite way, but the process is culturally adaptable. And that's where it really helps. So the process basically involves 6 phases. So the various phases starts out with the assess phase, where you identify the current state of where the organization is from a behavioral perspective. So an engagement survey is a good way to start. Focus group, interviews, reviewing exit data, reasons why people are exiting, reasons why people turn down offers for that company also gives you a lot of clues. And then moving into discover. And in discover phase is where you discover, what do you want your culture to be? So how do you decide what's in, what's out? If you've got a culture that already exists, what do you want to keep? What do you want to get rid of? What do you want to change? And then after that, identifying, articulating behaviors that align to that culture. The 4th phase is to activate it. And when you activate it, that means creating broad awareness across the company, ensuring that everybody knows about these behaviors. Again, I showed you everybody at SprintRay gets this embedment, which has the behaviors. All new hires get this their first day. And we don't just talk about it, we have them do a personal core values alignment to. So we have our new hires write down what their personal values are and align them to these behaviors. And it's usually a telltale to us that we might have made a hiring mistake if they're not able to do that alignment. But in most cases, they're able to do that because we changed our recruiting processes so that we're asking behavioral questions during the recruitment process to really assess if there's a culture fit. And then we also do a final interview, which was borrowed from an Amazon technique called the bar raiser. And when we look at the bar raiser, we're not looking at, are they going to raise the bar on performance? We're looking at, are they going to raise the bar on the relationship side of the business? Are they going to fit into our culture from a relationship perspective? So when you activate, you're actually making people aware, you're measuring the positive outputs and rewarding positive demonstration of behaviors. You're not yet concerned with mistakes or lack of demonstration because you want to motivate people to it. Then the next phase is called integrate. And when you integrate, that's when you have to go across your entire organization and look at all the ways you can integrate these behaviors into your processes, into your project kickoff teams, your recruiting, your onboarding, your ongoing development, your career discussions, your assessment dialogues, your bonus dialogues, everything. So we integrate it into all of our processes across. And in the last phase, we call transformation, which is where you're actually measuring the ongoing effects of that. Is it really moving the bar? And at SprintRay, we actually started with 9 behaviors. And after a year and a half, we discovered that some of these behaviors weren't really moving the bar. They were counterintuitive. They were more aspirational. So we desired it, but it really wasn't our culture. Here's an example of one that we eliminated. We used to have a behavior called work-life alignment. When you are a startup that is growing at the pace that we were growing and are growing at, work-life alignment is a little bit sacrificial at that point for most people who are coming in because you're always in catch-up mode. It's always lean because you're growing, you're expanding, and it's very difficult to keep up with it. And so you need to attract people who understand that sacrifice. And so promising work-life alignment and work-life balance when it wasn't really feasible at that point in our maturity. Now, someday it will be, and we'll put it back in. But at that point, it wasn't feasible. And so we had to make the decision, take it out, because as a company and as employees, felt like we were making a commitment that we couldn't achieve.
And it makes so much sense. And 2 things. One, I love that you have people put down their personal goals in alignment with the company behaviors. That I'm sure just reinforces this is a company that personally I believe in. They align with who I am and what I am as a person. Am I reading that right?
Yeah, exactly. Because if you look at our behaviors, put the customer first, solve problems, elevate all voices, speak up and speak out, and own your passion. It's very difficult for somebody to put their own values down and not be able to see an alignment to those values, because there's nothing in there that says we're asking you to give up who you are. We're not asking people to be inauthentic. In fact, we're encouraging authenticity by saying, here's what we expect of you. And you know what? If these behaviors don't resonate with you, we're not the right company for you. And so we don't want you to come here and suffer because this is the Kool-Aid that we're drinking.
So we talked earlier about there are consequences to this. Does this apply not only to everyone in the company, but what about partners, outsourced partners or agencies? Does it work in that kind of an environment as well?
So it can. Another company that I worked with, we actually had that. So the erstwhile Yahoo group, when Marissa Myers was there, they were having a lot of issues between their global PR group and their advertising companies and PR companies. All of them wanted access directly to Marissa. So they were bypassing the global PR group. So they brought me in and I worked with them, and we developed a series of behaviors that we were able to get them to sign on to as partners working together. So they developed what we called it a social agreement. So how were they going to work together? And basically they were really ways of working, but they were ways of working that were not procedural as much as they were behavioral. So lots of people think about ways of working and they'll put together lots of processes to support it, but they don't think about the behavioral aspects of it. How do you want people to show up and be with each other? That does not mean, by the way, that we don't have conflict in the companies that I work with. In fact, when I was at Booz Allen, there was a period of time the CEO basically expected pushback in meetings. He expected robust discussion. And there was a period of time that I was being quiet. And he called me into his office and he said, "Ed, you checked out? Are you not with us anymore?" And I said, "Why are you asking that?" And he said, "Because you've been quiet and you usually push back on stuff a lot more than you're doing now." And I said, "You know what? I'm not disagreeing with what you're saying right now. I'm just in that period where I feel like we're aligned. There's nothing to push back on." And so the expectation in that culture was that you should be pushing back and debating. It was a heavily debate culture. By the way, in a South Indian culture, it is not quite that way. You don't push back on the top leaders and you don't debate, especially in public. You take everything into private. So one of the behaviors that we had in India was praise in public, coach in private, which basically meant agree with each other in public. But if there's some sort of disagreement or something, always take that to private, because there's the whole concept of keeping face. You don't want somebody to lose face, especially if that's a leader in front of their people.
So there's behavior modifications, and then there's also the introduction of new behaviors.
Yes, new behaviors, existing behaviors in some cases. And then the key to have these work in any organization and work around the world is that you have to put boundaries to it. So we call that do's and don'ts, creating the do's and don'ts. So for the behavior, let's say praise in public, coach in private. What are the do's and don'ts of this? So the do's are, do compliment somebody on something that they're doing. If somebody challenges you, don't challenge back, offer to take it offline. So that became a common phrase in India, can we take this offline? And then one of the do's was, when you take it offline, inform everybody what was decided. Because if you take it offline and there's nothing resolved, then how do they know what direction you're going? So the do's and the don'ts set boundaries. And then that creates pretty much a third culture. So in organizations that are global, like we have offices in India, we have offices in China, Europe, here. So what we have is we have American culture, we have Indian culture, we have Asian culture, we have German culture. But what do we have when you piece it all together? We have the SprintRay culture, which is our common language and our common way of being with each other.
So I'm going to ask you, from everything that we've talked about here, if you could distill it down to the single most important takeaway that you want people to have after everything you've gone through, the processes, all the companies implemented it, tremendous ROIs that you've created, what do you want us to remember after viewing this podcast?
I would say the thing to remember is that behavior is a critical component to any organization's success. And not just any behavior, behavior that is aligned to the culture that you want for that organization. And when you define a company's culture, it does not necessarily mean who they are today. Culture does not necessarily say this is who we are. It can be who we want to be. And so it can be part of your journey of where you want to be. And then I think the other thing is you can't do it in isolation. This is not an HR task. It's really got to be an organizational task. So at SprintRay, the initial work on defining our culture and our behaviors was chaired by the CEO of the company. And we involved task teams and everything. I facilitated, but he was there to lead. And we've had leadership involvement all the way through. So it's not just about saying we're going to delegate this. No, you can't delegate culture. You can't delegate behavior. It's an everyone's decision. And I think that's where, even at SprintRay, as things have increased, the complexity has increased and the workload has increased, we've actually been surprised. We expected greater turnover, that people would just burn out and go. But our turnover has remained at right around 5 to 6%, very low. And a lot of that turnover ends up being people who either opt out, they're moving to another area, or they want to shift in their career, but we don't have that opportunity because we're still small, or they just decide that it's not really a fit for them, or we decide it's not a fit. But we haven't seen extensive turnover, and I credit the behaviors and the defining of the culture with the fact that that hasn't happened.
That was my number one takeaway, is that happy employees make happy customers make hypergrowth. So what you've done is you've just created an environment where people want to work there and like working there. But I know that people are going to have tons of questions after this. Would it be appropriate if we gave out, say, a link to your LinkedIn profile so that people could get a hold of you and ask questions?
Yeah, they can link in, they can ask questions. Absolutely. I prefer that they come to me with questions than come to me trying to sell me the latest, greatest AI tool, though, because it just seems like there are a billion AI options out there. And I'm getting to the point where I am even confused, because every day somebody's trying to tell me about their new AI tool, and it's happening so fast. It's like bombardment, so much faster than when the internet started to scale. It just seems like it's just phenomenally coming. And I think that's going to give another effect. We were actually having a debate the other day about how eventually your AI bot will become another team member. So how do you make sure you're instilling the right behavior so that everyone, including the bot, is following those behaviors? And so I think we're coming into an era where things are really going to be very interesting.
That's a whole nother podcast. We'll have you back for that one. Thank you, Ed, for everything you said here. Thank you so much for all of your insights and all of your perspectives. I really appreciate it.